Lafferty, Mr. Bonnet Rouge, Mr. Simpson, and Dr. Kelly. We do have you online and hear you. You're currently muted until you be called upon. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I now call this meeting to the Standing Committee on Accountability Oversight to order. My name is Steve Norton, and I'm MLA for the Tuneda riding, and I'm also chair of this committee. Today, members of the committee are joining us by phone and by video while they continue to socially distance and help reduce the spread of COVID-19. Today's meeting will be broadcast and live streamed. Committee will be hearing from the Honourable Shane Thompson, Minister of Environment and Natural Resources, about the 2020 fire season and the ability of the government to manage concurrent emergencies. Our first order of business on the agenda is to open our meeting with a prayer. I'll ask MLA Lafferty to offer a prayer. MLA Lafferty, the line is yours.
Merci, Mr. Chair. The negotiation we want to the COVID-19 tata guni no ne want who did that new we shall lot of that one more lot of that new to do at the sun is in dinner on soon as soon that the necessities of the necessity that in what I am as a cat at the deal there. Then is a going at the good naked shingo what I am as a cat at the deal there. MLA Society, security, nothing that the same I understand is nothing. Amen.
Let's see, MLA Lafferty. Our next item is review and adoption agenda, Mr. Clerk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we do have a public briefing followed by a number of in-camera matters. With committee's agreement, we'll proceed with the public hearing. At the end of the public hearing, after the witnesses have left, we'll go in camera to discuss the items on the agenda.
Mr. Choma, Mr. Rutland. Are there any additions or changes to the agenda? I'm looking through my message board, and I have Ms. Green, I think, that wants to speak to this. Ms. Green, the line is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, good. Mr. Chair, I read an item on CBC this week in which the government had set some restrictions on using self-isolation in the hub cities. They're using the same method we are, except they're using it outside of Nunavut. What the restriction they're setting is that if people are leaving the territory for non-essential reasons, that is to say it's not medical related, but rather it's a personal holiday or outing, then the government will not pay for the self-isolation costs when the person is ready to return to the territory. And the rationale is that this is an expensive undertaking and the money is needed in other areas. So I would like to put that on our agenda for today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, MLA Green. Are there any other changes or additions to the agenda that the members would like to speak to? The line is open. Okay, hearing no changes to the agenda, can I have a motion to approve the agenda as presented? Can I get a verbal confirmation or a visual from the cameras? Yeah, Ms. Cleveland. And one more thing too, I forgot to add is Emily Green has added the NWT residents returning to the agenda. And can I have a motion to approve the agenda as amended? Mr. Johnson? And the motion is order. Stand by.
Hello, it's the committee clerk. May I ask who just joined the line by phone?
Hey, good morning. It's Jackie.
Good morning, Mr. Jacobson. You're just going to be muted until called upon, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. And going back to the motion to approve the agenda, all those in favor? I don't hear any opposition. The motion is carried. After reviewing this portion, are there any declarations of conflict of interest? And I don't hear any. And we'll move on to our first public matter. And with that, good morning, Minister Thompson. Just before you beginning opening remarks, I'd like to discuss how the meeting will proceed. All comments and questions or remarks will need to be directed to the chair. And both members and witnesses will need to wait to be recognized by the chair before speaking. And this process too will allow the committee clerk to turn on and off the people's microphones. And with that, Minister Thompson, the line is yours.
Thank you, Chairperson Norn. Thank you, committee, for inviting us to be here today. I'm pleased to present on our planning for the upcoming fire season, including COVID-19 implications. With me from Environment and Natural Resources today are Deputy Minister Aaron Kelly, Director of Forest Management Mike Gravel, my Minister Special Advisor Jeff Ray, and from the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs Emergency Management Office, Eleanor Young, Deputy Minister of MACA, Russ Nuendorf, Associate Deputy Minister of MACA, Ivan Russell, Management of Emergency Measures. First, I would like to thank the ENR for all the hard work adapting the plans for this fire season to address challenges associated with COVID-19. A lot has been accomplished with people working from home and with the fire management staff supporting the Emergency Management Office in Yellowknife and the regions. To keep regular members informed, I shared an update on April 17th about ENR preparations for the 2020 fire season. Last week, ENR shared our plans and preparation with the Emergency Management Office, the Chief Public Health Officer, and the Financial Management Board. The Emergency Management Office agreed that our plan and preparations are appropriate, and the Chief Public Health Officer formally endorsed ENR's plans for the 2020 fire season. Late last week, the Financial Management Board approved additional funds at the beginning of the fire season so enhanced initial attack can occur. This additional funding will provide ENR with the ability to hire additional air tankers, helicopters, fire crews, and extra firefighters as an initiation task team and increase fire detection activities. The funding is a one-time supplement for the 2020 due to COVID-19 related challenges. On May 1st, once the plan was endorsed by the Chief Public Health Officer, agreed by the Emergency Management Office, and approved by the Financial Management Board, I sent an email updating to inform all MLAs. On May 24th, ENR delivered a public briefing on the upcoming fire season to ensure NWT communities and residents that we are ready for the season. Early weather forecasts are predicting hot and dry conditions for all Western Canada in June and July. This will result in high to extreme fire danger for the NWT. I will now turn it over to Mike Gravel, Director of Forest Management, with your permission. Mike will provide a presentation that includes that includes background information and describes our approach to firefighting in 2020. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Gravel, the line is yours. Mr. Gravel, the line is yours. Just double check your mic to make sure that you're not muted.
Mr. Gravel, can you check you are unmuted. If you can just check your connection or turn your camera on to allow us to hear you better. Thank you.
Me now?
Yeah, okay, we can hear you now. Yeah, proceed, Mr. Gravel.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and sorry about the technical difficulty there. I trust the deck is in front of you all, and I'll start with slide number 2. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you some of the challenges of managing the fire program during the COVID-19 health emergency and ENR's planned actions in response. For today's presentation, I'll provide a high-level overview of fire in the territory and the management actions we take. I'll provide some quick insight into fire management and infectious diseases, including some linkages and risks associated with COVID-19, along with some of the challenges facing the fire program due to COVID-19. You will hear what our goals and objectives are, including strategies to manage fire, smoke, and community evacuations given COVID-19. For your reference, the fire response budget will be reviewed, and this will lead us into ENR's plans for 2020, and we can continue with discussions and questions. I'll move to slide 3. It is important when we talk about fighting fires that we first recognize that fire is a natural ecosystem process, and the GNWT cannot afford to keep fire off the landscape completely, be it financially or ecologically. The forests are designed to burn, and they need to burn. Each fire that is actioned increases the risk for future years as the buildup of forest fuels increases to a point where controlling new fires becomes much more difficult. This results in greater human, financial, and ecological impacts. Historically, ENR actions less than half of the fires in any given fire season. Some of the proposed actions shared in this presentation, such as actioning more fires, are only intended for 2020 due to COVID-19. Slide 4. There are several ways fires are actioned in the Northwest Territories. As mentioned, more than half of the territory's fires are not controlled and are simply monitored. Initial attack is the main method we use to fight fires. Initial attack refers to the first 24 hours that action is taken to control a fire, and often only requires 4 firefighters and a helicopter, and may or may not require tankers. Sustained action is used when initial attack fails. If a fire cannot be controlled in the first 24 hours, additional firefighters and aircraft are often required. It may take days or weeks to control a fire depending on the situation. In many cases, an incident management team may be brought in to manage these fires, and some sustained action costs can be in the millions of dollars. Limited action is an option used if action is only taken on a portion of a fire. For example, a fire might include a burnout along a creek to keep the fire from spreading past that point, but the rest of the fire is left alone. Another limited action method is rather than fight the fire, we would take action around a cabin to protect it. An abandoned fire is one that we tried to fight but were not successful, and rather than put additional resources and money into the fire, we back off. Abandoned fires will either be monitored or have limited action taken. Some reasons for pulling off the fire may include not having enough resources that can be added, or more often the case, the risk near communities is too high to justify having all our resources tied to one fire in a remote area. Abandoned fires usually occur in areas where the fire is not a threat to communities or values. So rest assured, a fire that threatened the community would never be abandoned. Slide 5. With respect to infectious diseases, wildfires that require many people to manage, so the large sustained action fires, create an ideal environment for the transmission of infectious diseases. People are forced to live and work in close quarters. They sleep close to each other in what can be called, are often referred to as tent cities. They eat close together, often in a buffet style, and the nature of the work requires them to travel and work side by side. Fire personnel also work in extreme environmental conditions such as smoke and heat. The work is physically demanding, and when you add in a lack of sleep, all this stress on the body can compromise immune systems. Working on a fire is not a clean job. There's often little access to soap or sanitizers while you're working. And an additional challenge is the requirements for support. Crews may come from other communities or even other provinces. Pilots are often from the south, and there are many contractors, truck drivers, and other personnel who are part of this transient workforce. On to slide 6. There are some additional risks between managing fire and COVID-19. Managing fires require people to work in close proximity to each other. Physical distancing is not possible, whether it be traveling to a fire by aircraft or vehicle, or when on site. Whether it's setting up pumps or pulling a hose around a fire, this all requires teamwork and people working alongside one another. Fires can also produce large volumes of smoke that can further complicate health conditions for a portion of the population. And in worst case scenarios, fire can force communities to evacuate. This would displace residents from current isolation. It would be a challenge to maintain physical distancing while evacuating large numbers of people. And it would put additional stress on local municipalities, residents, emergency response, and public health. On to slide 7. To put in perspective what a challenging fire season could look like, we don't have to look too far. In 2014, we had a challenging fire season that cost the GNWT approximately $56 million in firefighting costs. 2 communities were forced to evacuate, and I do not have the estimates of the financial or social costs associated with those evacuations. Nearly 1,000 people were brought on to assist ENR. 485 extra firefighters were added for almost every community, and 468 additional firefighters were brought in from across the country and Alaska. As bad as the situation was in 2014, it would be far worse if this were repeated in 2020, and ENR wants to do its best to prevent this scenario from repeating itself and avoiding adding stress to the public health and emergency management. To slide 8. It is important to recognize that COVID-19 has already started making the 2020 fire season more challenging. Reduced commercial flights means there is less public fire detection. ENR takes advantage of daily flights between many communities to be the eyes in the sky. ENR will need to increase its detection efforts through aircraft charters as a result. Reduced commercial flights will also limit our ability to move firefighters. ENR will require more chartered flights to move crews. And for your awareness, moving crews is a very common and necessary practice. Another challenge is other jurisdictions are also planning to increase fire response capabilities. This could limit ENR's ability to add resources when needed, such as helicopters, air tankers, and possibly firefighters. As a result, we plan to have additional resources in place upfront. Groceries and supplies may also be limited, and ENR does not want to be in a position where it clears out a community grocery store, so we will need to bulk order supplies in advance as a precaution to ensure necessary supplies are in place. On to slide 9. Based on weather model predictions provided by Natural Resources Canada, the outlook for the summer is a normal month of May, followed by well above average conditions for June and July, which will result in high to extreme fire danger. And this will not only affect us, but all of Western Canada. And again, this could put a strain on the availability of resources should we need them. This is not a good scenario to be facing when your goal is to limit large fires and avoid having sustained action fires. Having high to extreme fire danger is the perfect scenario to have multiple fires at one time, and this is one of the reasons why fire escape initial attack. Additional resources are needed to successfully contain fires in these conditions. On to slide 10. Our goal in fire management is always to ensure the safety of fire personnel and the public, and to protect communities or high-value areas from wildfire. To support this goal in 2020, we have three primary objectives. We want to mitigate situations that place the public or firefighting resources at higher risk of exposure to COVID-19 due to our response activities. So essentially, we want to avoid having to bring large groups of people together to manage those large fires. We want to mitigate air quality concerns that could add to the public health workload, and we want to reduce the threat of an escape fire, forcing the evacuation of residents or communities, which again would compound issues affecting the ongoing pandemic response. Slide 11. To achieve these objectives, ENR's fire response strategies include actioning more fires, particularly early in the season, thereby reducing the amount of fire on the landscape. We will expand the area of initial attack with the objective of minimizing the potential for large fires on the landscape and risk to communities. This can also reduce the amount of smoke entering communities. We will need to increase detection efforts of high-value areas and expand detection across the NWT so fires are found small and the likelihood of containment is greater. ENR will implement fire bans when appropriate to reduce human-caused fires according to fire ban guidelines, and there will be no issuance of permits to burn when the fire danger is moderate or higher, again to remove the risk of unnecessary human-caused fires. On to slide 12. ENR assesses every fire, and decisions on the type of response is made based on the threat to human life, values at risk, and growth potential. A fire spread potential is also analyzed for any fire that is not actioned. So for any monitored fire that has a potential of growing large, we may take limited action to limit its growth and reduce smoke. While we do expect to take action on more fires than usual, we are not presuming that every fire will be fought. The picture on this slide here is a fire history map east of Fort Smith, commonly referred to as the Caribou Range. Fire has played a natural role in this area, with few fires being initial attacked. Nearly all of the Caribou Range has burned in recent history, that being the last 60 plus years, and these old burns help keep future fire spread contained. In this scenario, fires can often be monitored with management actions focused on protecting cabins and other values. In this same picture, you can notice at the bottom left, the area closest to Fort Smith. This shows a lot of the light green where there's no fire history. Fires in this area have historically been fought, and due to fuel buildup in this area, fires will require rapid initial attack. This scenario around Fort Smith is common around many of our communities. Fighting fires near communities has led to little fire history and increased risk from future fires. For perspective, ENR has fought nearly 1,500 fires in the last 30 years within 30 kilometers of a community. So that's an average of nearly 50 fires a year being fought near communities. This means the risk of fire is greatest around our communities, and this is where we keep our resources. In addition, there's recent concerns over boreal caribou habitat have increased pressure on the department to take action in more remote areas to aid in caribou recovery. To slide 13. With respect to managing smoke, we'll do so on a case-by-case basis for monitored fires. ENR will work with the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs to monitor smoke risk, and ENR will promote using fresh air facilities to vulnerable people if wildfire smoke reaches communities. We are also planning to allocate an ignition task team to manage monitored fires with the objective of minimizing overall fire size and reduce overall volume of smoke. This would be a small team that could use indirect attack methods to limit fire growth and reduce the overall amount of smoke. On to slide 14. To reduce the risk of escape fires, ENR intends to increase detection of high-value areas with the goal of finding fires as small as possible and increase the likelihood of initial attack success. Fires that we intend to fight will have an aggressive initial attack by enhancing current response efforts, and any indications of potential for failed initial attack should result in additional initial attack resources. The intent here is to try and avoid sustained action fires. As mentioned, these are the more expensive fires that get more difficult and costly to control with every day that they grow, and they need large numbers of people to come together, which we want to avoid. ENR will use an ignition task team to manage monitored fires with the objective of minimizing overall size and potential risk for later in the summer. So this ignition task team can help limit both fire size and smoke, and this task team is also an option to use for protecting caribou habitat in more remote areas. To slide 15. With respect to ENR's budget, the suppression budget covers the fixed cost of managing wildfires with a small amount available for variable costs. ENR requires supplemental funding in most years to cover the variable fire management costs. As mentioned, without fighting a single fire, we know 2020 will require increased variable costs due to COVID-19. For perspective, on average, a successful initial attack fire costs roughly $20,000 to control. This does not include the cost of having resources available, but it reflects the cost of actioning the fire. In comparison, sustained action fires, again, those multi-day fires and potentially weekly long fires, can be very costly. Some examples, 2018 was one of our slowest fire seasons on record, and we still had one sustained action fire cost $800,000. On the high end, we had a $4 million fire as part of the 2014 season. In 2016, we had a $2 million fire. And every year I can give an example essentially of fires costing near $1 million or more than $1 million. So it's common to have multi-million-dollar fires associated with sustained action. On to slide 16. A further illustration of the suppression budget is shared here with the firefighting costs for the last 10 years. And as you can see, fire costs are highly variable depending on the year and the fire load. The average cost of fighting fires over the past 10 years has been $19.5 million, with the 2020 suppression budget set at $14 million. ENR's plans have been shared with the Financial Management Board, the Chief Public Health Officer, and the Emergency Management Organization. There is consensus that the plan being put forward is justified and acceptable, and as a result, an additional $3.8 million in funding is being provided to ENR at the start of the 2020 fire season to ensure resources are in place and reduce the likelihood of problem fires. While everything possible to control fires this summer, the unpredictable nature of fire means there is always a possibility that additional resources, including more funding, could be required. On to slide 17. So ENR's overall plan, as mentioned, is to increase initial attack capabilities. This plan will include a 60-day air tanker contract for one CL-215 group, so 2 CL-215s. We will have the ability to add additional helicopters to increase our initial attack coverage as required. As discussed, we will have a task team used to manage monitored fires in an effort to cost-effectively limit fire size and smoke volume when possible. We are going to look at opportunities to add fire crews in small communities that do not have crews, such as Sigachik and a few others, and we will also look to complement our crews where we can. We also want to be able to use more EFFs or Type 3 crews to mop up initial attack fires. In a common year, our Type 1 crews would initial attack a fire and they would stay on the fire until it is out. But for this year, we want to have our initial attack crews bring the fire under control and then switch in extra firefighters to mop up the fire so our Type 1 fire crews can be ready to fight the next fire. As discussed, there's a real need to increase detection across the territory, so we will be requiring additional charter aircraft for smoke patrols. And if we are to add aircraft and fight more fires, we know there's going to be associated increased costs for things such as transportation, fuel, supplies, and even retardant. So this proactive approach provides some insurance against the increased risk. It can reduce further complications of ongoing challenges of managing COVID-19, and it could end up being a less expensive response in the long run if we can avoid potential sustained action fire costs. And then on to slide 18. So to conclude, I hope this presentation has offered sufficient background on the issue and information on actions ENR intends to take. I did not outline all the operational planning that has happened, but I can tell you we have developed numerous best practices. We've collaborated closely with other fire managers across the country to ensure we have the best advice. Our planning has been reviewed by the Chief Public Officer, who was very supportive of the planning that has gone into preparing for the 2020 fire season. Our plans have followed the advice of the Chief Public Health Officer, and we have taken extra precautions to ensure the safety of our staff and the public. An example of this, ENR has had all returning staff from the south self-isolate for 14 days, even though technically they could have been exempted as essential employees. I welcome any questions or discussions you would like to have.
Mr. Gravel. Mr. Thompson, would you like to add to this or have anybody from your staff to add to this presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I think Mr. Gravel did a great job presenting the information. This is the fourth time I've had the opportunity to go through it, and it's well done. So thank you.
Mr. Thompson. Okay, with that, we'll go to we'll do a round of questions, Q&A with the regular members, and we'll do one round. And if we have enough time, we'll try to do a second round. And I'll ask the members just to keep their dialogue short and try to get the questions out as quickly as they can. And up first, I have Mr. Bonnerouge. Emily Bonnerouge, the line is yours.
Mr. Chair. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, I'd like to say Mussy to ENR Minister and to the Director, Mike Gravel, for the presentation. Some really, really good information presented today. I think we're all aware that there's a proposed, or will be, a wood pellet mill in the NWT located at Enterprise that's operated by Aurora Wood Pellet. They're looking at probably 200,000 metric ton of wood product for the plant. The Aurora Wood Pellet has two forestry management agreements for the supply of timber to the mill. I think these were done through ENR or GWT. The current forest management agreements are with Fort Providence and Fort Resolution, with other communities likely to come on board for the supply to Aurora Wood Pellet. There's a vast amount of timber supply around the communities that are within access by roads, or that roads can be constructed to gain access to the timber. It is always a major concern that forest fires in this industry can destroy a livelihood, considering many people in the communities count on the much-needed work. My question to the minister is, has the department been in meaningful consultations with the communities as to their forest management plans and the need to recognize areas of protection from forest fires? Masi.
Mr. Emily Bonnerouge, Minister Thompson, I'm yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Bonnerouge, for that question. So we've been in conversations with Mr. Mapes on this as well. My understanding from Mr. Gravel is a number of communities have been in contact with the department and working with them. But for further information, with your permission, I'll ask Mr. Gravel to give you further information on that. Thank you.
Minister Thompson, Mr. Gravel, the line is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so we've been working with all the communities in the forested areas. In the past year, we've updated the community wildfire protection plans, which outlines recommendations communities can take to reduce the risk around their communities. As another example, our department worked with the community of Fort Providence on a proposal to the federal government, and the Fort Providence was able to secure $100,000 this year to upgrade and enhance their fuel break around their community. So that's just one other example. And we look forward to the Aurora wood pellets getting established, because we do see opportunities there to work with them and the forest management agreement holders to use the wood near communities as a biomass supply, and also reduce the risk to communities through fire smart planning. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Gravel. And love the Stevie Y jersey in the background, by the way. Okay, all right, moving along. I have Mr. Johnson, Emily Johnson, the line is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've seen a number of other jurisdictions have brought fire bans in already. And I was kind of wondering if you could give us a sense of the change in how we're going to be approach fire bans. My understanding is that we rarely ever do fire bans outside of municipal or parks. And I'd like to speak of whether we're going to continue that. I do understand the rationale is that if people are having a fire in one of our territorial parks, it's usually in a contained area, which is much safer. But we do have the ability to close districts. Can I get a sense of how often we've done that in the past, and whether that'll change in COVID, whether we can see kind of a territorial-wide fire ban put in place? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily Johnson. Minister Thompson. Mr. Gravel, would you like to take that response?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah. So that is correct. In the past, we have not implemented fire bans during my career with ENR, and I've been with the department for over 25 years. However, given the situation for 2020, we have developed fire ban guidelines that uses science as and thresholds for us to implement a fire ban if needed. A little bit of background: the Northwest Territories doesn't have some of the same problems as other jurisdictions. So some jurisdictions have human-caused fire problems that range in the 50 to 90% of the fires are caused by humans, where in the Northwest Territories we're much lower than that. So fortunately, we don't have a large human-caused fire problem. That being said, we do want to make sure that there's little risk from human-caused fires this year, and if the conditions require it, we will be looking to implement fire bans. With respect to it being territory-wide, that would really depend on the fire environment. The Northwest Territories is very large, as you all know, and implementing a territory-wide fire ban may not be necessary. Some parts of the territories may be hot and dry and require, could require a fire ban, whereas at the same time, other parts of the territories could be cool and wet, and it wouldn't make sense necessarily to have fire bans in those situations. So we will look to put fire bans in place when the fire environment dictates and essentially the risk is high. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Gravel. Just stand by for a moment. Everybody in the call here, just to bring to everybody's attention, we just lost Minister Thompson on the line. So if Ms. Young or Mr. Russell have anything to add to as well, feel free to chime in. Do you have anything to say to the members? The line is open. Okay. Moving along, up next I have Miss Semler, Emily Semler. The line is yours. Ms. Semler, the line is yours. Just double check your mic, please. Okay, moving along. Mr. Jacobson, the line is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nothing at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobson. Mr. Simpson, do you have any questions?
With the COVID-19 orders in place, I'm just wondering the added cost, I guess, to address those during the fire season. And I'm just wondering if there's a number that the department came up with or a percentage. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Mr. Gravel, would you like to take that response?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our assessment so far has been to look at what we need to do to properly prepare for the fire season ahead of us and make sure we have the ability to respond as quick as possible. So that's where the budget request came from. Again, a large portion of that request is for additional aircraft, which will, in our view, help us with our initial attack. And if we can avoid failed initial attack, we can avoid having large groups of people having to come together to fight fires. If we do have those sustained action fires, that is where things get much more complicated, and we may have increased costs for those fires for how we lay out our camps, how we serve our personnel, whether it be the meals or additional safety measures. But again, our goal right now is to be proactive up front and try to have aggressive initial attack and avoid the potential for those scenarios. So at this time, until we experience a situation like that, I wouldn't be able to say what the actual cost would be. But again, our measures are to avoid those types of scenarios. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Goodall. And moving along, I have Ms. Green up next. Ms. Green, the line is yours.
For the Alberta Fire Service in their fire management division for 7 summers. And I was at university a number of years ago. And that was the era where Alberta had granted Japanese pulp producers wide access to, particularly to aspen, but to the forests. And so there was a lot at stake in making sure that the forests didn't burn, so that the trees could be harvested and made into toilet paper. So I really feel there's a lot of potential with this this particular focus on initial attack. In my years with forestry, I saw this work. There were fires that needed sustained action, even so, but it reduced the numbers of fires that got out of control. So my question is about isolation. So in the event that there is a fire for which you need more resources, human and equipment resources from the south, how will the isolation of those resources be handled? Will there be isolation? And if not, then how can the mixing of people from the south and the people who are residents of the NWT be managed so that COVID contagion is not a risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Minister Thompson, would you like to take that response?
Yeah, I apologize. This technology is not working here. I got cut out, so I had to phone in, and then anyway, make a long story short. So our understanding is that we have worked developing an isolation plan where the crews would be isolated from each other. We're trying to make sure if we're hoping we don't have to, is if we do have to bring people in, we would have them isolate from the other crews from the south, and we would have locations where we would do that. So we've already looked at that. There's a plan in place, and again, it's about when they get back from the fire, it's about isolation and making sure that they self-isolate and they contain themselves. So we're working on it. If we have a season like 2014, Mr. Cavell would probably have to give you a further detail of what we're planning on doing there. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Thompson. Mr. Cavell, the line is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister Thompson was right on the mark there. We've put plans in place for contingencies. If we do have to bring personnel in, we will essentially treat our firefighters under our bubble, and we will keep import resources under their bubble and keep the two separate as best we can. We do feel confident that we could manage fires in that way effectively. It may even involve bringing an entire team from a certain jurisdiction to manage one fire on our behalf, and we leave our resources to manage the other fires. But it is our goal to keep our resources separate and to have some confidence that we're not increasing the risk of infection in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Cavell. And moving along, we have Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. O'Reilly, the line is yours.
I think I heard during the presentation that there's an extra $3.8 million for fire suppression, and I'm looking at slide 16. The 2020 suppression budget is shown there as $14,055,000. Does that number include the extra $3.8 million, or is that on top of that? And generally, what does the $3.8 million really cover? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister Thompson, line's yours.
Thank you. That's an additional on top of the money that you've seen, the 14 million plus. It's on top of it. As for the breakdown, it's we talked about it's extra firefighters, charters, transportation, get people out, to also air tankers, and we're also talking about basically everything that in my minister's opening comments there, it involves those things there. If you just wait one sec. So again, it's helicopters, it's fire crews, it's extra firefighters, it's an initiation TAC team, and increased initial dictation activities. So in other words, we're looking at, because right now we used to rely on public aircrafts, we probably have to have more people up in the air and that. So those are the areas there. For further detail, I'll ask Mr. Cavell if I've missed anything. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Cavell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, the minister, I think, hit the mark there. When we provided our plan to FMB, we broke down what we forecasted we would need for additional air tankers. We're going to move ahead with a 60-day contract to bring on an extra CL-215 group. We've got some additional funds so that we can add additional helicopters at the start of the season as needed. So if the fire danger increases, we will bring resources on. Just for some perspective with that, ENR has 5 long-term helicopters, and we have 28 communities to protect. And so as you can imagine, 5 helicopters for 28 communities is a pretty thin margin. So we will look to add additional helicopters as needed so that we'll have resources in place to respond if there's new starts. Again, the detection is another big piece for us. With the loss of commercial flights or the lack of commercial flights, we will be doing a lot more smoke patrols in an effort to find fires as soon as they start. So there's an increased cost with that. And then we will be looking to position additional crews across the territory, so hiring additional crews for the summer. And then as well, hiring EFFs as required. If we get fires, we will add firefighters to go on to those fires, which will again allow us to put our Type 1 firefighters back in the queue to initial attack the next fire. So ultimately, the 3.8 is going to go to additional aircraft and additional firefighters and the associated cost with any increased number of fires we fight. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Gravel. And moving along, I have Ms. Cleveland up next. Line is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Just in line with MLA Green's question about our ability to isolate crews away from our communities, one of my biggest concerns bringing in workers from the south would be not only our ability to isolate them away from northern workers, but also away from our northern communities, especially in the event that somebody does have COVID-19 and does bring it up to a remote site where they are working with other crews, even if it is other southern crews. So I guess my question there is, will we be doing testing at sites, or how will you be monitoring at different remote work sites for COVID-19? And what is the expectation for ENR as to how those firefighters are treated? Are they going to be treated or expected to be treated in the Northwest Territories by our healthcare system, or will they be sent back to their home province to be treated? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cleveland. Minister Thompson.
Thank you for that depth of detail. I'll ask Mr. Gravel to answer that question. Thank you.
Merci, Cho. Minister Thompson. Mr. Gravel, the line is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we're working closely with our partners across the country, the other provinces, to confirm the best practices with respect to exporting personnel. We are looking at the option of before groups are brought into the Northwest Territories that they would be tested before coming. We're still working through that process to ensure there's a timely test that can work, knowing that there's limitations to the testing as well. I'll also just provide a little bit of background to how we are planning to deal with importing of personnel. The imported personnel would essentially depart from a local, I'll just call it a tanker base for this example, but a local departmental site. So they won't be going through airports. They'll be essentially bused to the tanker base. They'll get on a chartered flight. They will arrive in the Northwest Territories at one of our tanker bases, where they'll be offloaded onto a bus and then transported to the fire, or ferried by aircraft to the fire. So they will not be going through airports, public sites, or communities. They won't be given access to restaurants or anything like that. So we will be keeping any personnel brought to the Northwest Territories isolated from the rest of the population. With respect, if somebody were to become ill while in the territories, we are still working through some of those details, but it is my understanding that we would need to deal with that individual in the Northwest Territories following the self-isolation protocols put in place by the Chief Public Health Officer. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Gravel. And moving along, I do not have any questions at this time, so we could go on to a second round of questions. Going down my list here, Mr. Bonnerouge, Did you want to ask a second question?
Let's see, Mr. Chair, am I on?
Yes, you are. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's related to my first question. My preamble, I talked about the Aurora Wood Pellet Mill and the agreements they have with First Nations people that would create employment and protecting areas where they have merchantable timber. I know there was a concern brought by the communities in the past about ENR just letting the fires burn, and they were burning this timber is probably value at risk timber because it creates employment. It's got an economy tied to it. And my question wasn't really answered. I know they mentioned they got Providence as 100,000, but that's to improve a fire guard. What I had asked is, was there any meaningful consultations with the First Nations and in the communities about what areas they would like protected to stimulate their economy related to the Aurora Wood Pellet Mill plant coming up? I'm wondering if I can get some sort of answer to that. Mussy.
Thank you, Mr. Monrouge. Minister Thompson, would you like to take that response?
So first and foremost, so in my conversations with Mr. Mapes and the department, and when we talk to Aurora Pellets, the two communities right now that they are having agreements with is Fort Res and Fort Providence. So they have that consultation. We're working with them. However, so everybody's aware, when I talked to Mr. Mapes about it, it's basically within the parameters of making it profitable. If it's outside that district and looking at the riding that I represent, it's not feasible for the timber to be cut and brought to Aurora to make be profitable. So that there, again, it's a business opportunity. I know in one of the communities I represent, they're working with the Department of Forestry to talk about business, starting about a sawmill, and so they're working with them on that. But as for the other consultation, and I apologize, I wasn't on here, so at this point in time, I'd like Mr. Gravel to, maybe he could elaborate because I didn't hear the rest of it, so thank you.
Thank you, Minister Thompson. Mr. Gravel, line's yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So with respect to the forest management areas, we obviously know where these areas are, and we have included them as part of our values at risk database for fire management decision making. However, these forest management areas are quite large, and so the entire potential harvest area is not necessarily going to have every fire action. Rather, what we do is where communities or the company has investments, such as laying out blocks for future harvest, we identify these as a higher priority for protection from fires, so that investment is protected. I also mentioned that the Aurora Wood Pellets has the ability to utilize both burnt and unburned wood. So even if a fire does impact a portion of an FMA area, that doesn't necessarily change the volume of wood that they'll have available to them. Now, obviously, they don't want all burnt wood, but they do have the ability to utilize some burnt wood. With respect to consultations with the communities, again, at the community level, we've updated community wildfire protection plans, and this has been reviewed with the communities, and their input was included in those plans. However, that focuses on the community proper, if you will, right in the vicinity of the towns. With respect to other valuable areas that communities would like to see protected, that discussion occurs on an annual basis when we go into each community every year to discuss our fire operations We typically review what happened last year and open the floor for opportunities to discuss other issues such as important areas to the communities. I don't have specifics with respect to Fort Providence as to what those communications entailed, but I do know that we meet each year with communities, and I suspect if this is an issue or concern, it's something that we can address directly with the communities going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Gravel. And going down my list here, I have Emily Johnson. Mr. Johnson, line is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know that other jurisdictions, I saw BC just was permitted their tree planting season to go ahead. I know our reforestation efforts look largely different than other jurisdictions, but I do believe we accessed over $100,000 of reforestation money in regards to from the federal government for climate change. And I do believe there's quite a bit more money on that table in regards to reforestation. Can I just get a sense of how the funding we're using is going to be affected by COVID and whether there's any reforestation efforts being planned this season or how that looks going forward? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily Johnson. Minister Thompson, line is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we've been in contact with the federal government. They have a huge chunk of money. We've talked to the minister and we've asked them how we can tap into that opportunity to get more money from the feds to do it. As for the detail on what we're using the existing money for, I'll ask Mr. Cavell to give further information on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Thompson. Mr. Cavell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we have a project underway using funds from the Low Carbon Economy Fund, and this is a multi-year project that includes both planting and thinning operations. And we've been in discussions with the federal government regarding the ability for us to adjust our plans to postpone some of the planned activities for this year into the future without losing the funding. And my understanding is we're in good standing with that request, and we'll be looking to modify our plans to postpone for this year as much as we can, given the COVID-19, and to reduce, again, any risk of transmission or infection related to COVID-19. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Gravel. And moving down my list here, I have Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, do you have any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess my concern is that with the weak economy or a non-existent one in the territories here now, we have a number of contractors and that are looking for business opportunities, and also a number of residents looking for employment. So I'm wondering how the department has or will address that issue to ensure that the businesses in the NWT and the residents are given and provide a priority to any work or any contracts that come up if required during fire season. Thank you.
Good question. Okay, good. All right, thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Thompson, line is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, so we have made sure it's a priority. We are looking at making sure we can utilize as many people as possible, as many businesses as possible, but making sure that we just want to hire people just to hire people, but we're hiring contractors and businesses to achieve the job we need to do. We've been working with businesses and communities already, as you can see by the plan presented here. It's with just $3.8 million, with the focus of the money staying in the north where possible. However, if the fire season becomes like 2014, then we're going to have to bring people in from down south. But right now, our priority is to get our teams in there, have extra firefighters, and have communities working with them and businesses. So it is a priority with the department, and we're working, and we've heard it very clearly throughout, even before the this COVID-19 situation happened. We heard it very clearly on the election trail. We want to make sure Northerners are utilized as best we can, whether that's businesses or local people getting to work. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Thompson. And moving along, I got Ms. Green. Ms. Green, the line is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chair, I'm aware that many NWT residents have applied for the emergency benefit, the CERB, from the federal government and have received that benefit. It pays up to $500 a week. I'm wondering two things related to this. How would firefighter wages compare to the CERB payment? And has the minister considered that with a number of people collecting CERB, the pool of labor may be smaller than other years? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Minister Thompson, line is yours.
Thank you. And as for the wages, how it compares, I will ask Michael Gravel to do it. But my understanding, when I talk to the firefighters, they're all excited. They've been asking when they can get to work. I don't think the CERB is going to be as clear or as much as this they have. And the big thing, from what I understand when I talk to the people, they get enough hours here to get on EI afterwards. So they work to get the money moving forward. And as for our staff, we haven't heard a shortage. I've heard people actually more people want to get to work, and we might not be able to hire everybody. In saying that, Mr. Gravel could maybe talk about the wage information. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Thompson. Up next, I have Mr. Riley. Sorry, my mistake. I have Mr. Gravel up next. Would you like to speak, Mr. Gravel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I concur with Minister Thompson's assessment that early indications to us is that the firefighters want to be working, and so we are trusting that we can get the people we need hired and it provides, as you said, long-term solutions, so these people can work for the summer and then have the ability to collect EI if they need through the winter, where the CERB is very much a short-term solution given the current situation, and no one knows how long that may last. With respect to the wage and CERB equity, with respect to a firefighting crew, I don't have the exact numbers with me, but just as a rough estimate, I would say that the CERB is less than 40% as to what a firefighter would make on a weekly basis. So again, I think financial incentive would be to work versus not work. And early indications with the people we've talked to is there's an interest and desire to have this summer employment, knowing full well that it could lead to longer term employment in the long run as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Gravel. Up next, I have Mr. Riley. Mr. Riley, the line is yours.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. In the verbal presentation, but not on the slides, there was some mention of efforts to try to protect caribou habitat, and I'm wondering if I can have a little bit more explanation of what that entails and if there's a map available of caribou habitat that is used in terms of fire suppression. If that could be provided to MLAs, I don't know if it's available to the public as well. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Minister Thompson, line is yours.
Thank you. For the detail, I'll go to Mr. Gravel, but the commitment is, yes, we will provide that information to committee. And I cannot see why we couldn't put that information out publicly as well. So we will work with committee to get that information through the proper channels. But if Mr. Cravell could talk about the habitat in the detail, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Cravell?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's actually a few simultaneous processes going on with respect to caribou habitat. There's boreal caribou range planning occurring. So in the South Slave, for example, they've started the boreal caribou range planning in that area. And so we are working with that group and using their community knowledge and traditional knowledge to identify these areas. So that process is still ongoing. As well, we're working with the Tlicho government, again, using traditional knowledge and the users of the land knowledge as to the critical habitat for caribou. That, again, is an ongoing process. We're developing these. We've been having discussions, but we haven't formally produced maps as a final product. So it's under development. Having said that, through the process, we've increased our awareness and understanding of what some of the important areas are. And as early as last summer, we started taking action on some fires that historically we would not have actioned, again, just due to caribou habitat protection and a goal there of trying to give the caribou every opportunity to recover as best we can. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cravell. And up next, I have Ms. Cleveland. Ms. Cleveland, the line is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Before COVID-19 hit us, when we were doing our main estimates, we talked a lot about the potential cost of having a really bad fire season this year. And so now we're in this discussion right now about the potential of having a very dry, hot summer mixed with COVID-19 and the impacts of that on our budget as the Northwest Territories could be quite large. And so I'm wondering how and what is ENR tracking in order to attribute additional costs, for example, in potential charter flights, in increased crew so that we can space people out more, potential for additional camps, because we need to space people out more and we need to segregate the southern workers from the northern workers. And so how is ENR tracking those additional costs so that they can correlate them to the overall cost of COVID-19? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cleveland and Minister Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for that detail. I'll have to ask Mr. Cravell to provide information. Thank you.
Mr. Cravell, the line is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, ENR has fairly strong systems in place to track costs. We have our own financial tracking system in addition to SAM, so we are able to do essentially daily cost tracking of all expenditures related to the fire program. For COVID-19 specifically, were we to get into these sustained action fires that require imports, we will have the ability to identify or separate the costing. So again, that will be something that's analyzed as the fire season occurs and afterwards. Likewise, the additional costs, that the 3.8 million, for example, is an additional cost. We'll be able to track those expenditures as they occur, and essentially my best answer would be that we would have to report at the end of the season and show the breakdown in comparison to our historical costs, what we've had to expend for camp expenses, for detection expenses, and for other expenses that may be additional this year due to COVID-19. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cravell. And I'm up next for questions. So I just listening to the questions here, I know that Mr. O'Reilly asked for some, or was asked some questions about the caribou habitat. If we get some maps from your department, Mr. Thompson, and provide it to committee, please. And so anyways, going back to my question here, so I know that there's EFF training, that emergency firefighter training for this fire season, and I would just like to know, to ask the minister if this training program will be offered in the communities. Thank you. Minister Thompson, the line is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Chair, the training is still being offered. It's going to be offered differently because we have to understand, because of COVID-19 and about reducing the number of people in an area. So we've gone to virtual in some of those areas. As for the fitness in that, I'll ask Mr. Cavell to provide that further information to you there. But my understanding is the communities will be still getting the fire training. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Thompson. Mr. Cavell, line's yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, with respect to the fitness training, there's national standards that are in place regarding the exporting of resources. So whenever we share resources, all resources across the country have to meet the same standard. Our plan for this summer is to modify our fitness testing to meet the territorial standard, and so we can conduct the territorial testing in each community without requiring firefighters to move. And if there's a situation where we plan to export our Type 1 crews, the crews that we plan to export will then be brought together to do the fitness testing to meet that national standard. So it's a modification of how we would typically conduct our training, but it allows us to meet the national standard with the minimal amount of risk to our firefighters. And then, as Minister Thompson has already answered, we've made many modifications to how training is delivered this year. And we've also assessed what training is mandatory versus what is optional, if you will. And a lot of the optional training is being postponed this year, or delayed at the very least, until we see what the situation is. We've assessed the number of trained personnel we have for both extra firefighters that are current. So much of the training we deliver is valid for 2 or 3 years, depending on what training you received. And so we've assessed what the numbers are, and we're confident we have a sufficient number of trained personnel, as we've been doing a lot of training the past few years. So at the very least, if we did not conduct training for extra firefighters, for example, this year, we have a sufficient pool that are already trained and ready to go. But we will be looking at opportunities to deliver training, particularly in smaller communities where the numbers would be smaller on their own, so a reduced risk. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for that. And just, I'm just wondering if your department, Minister Thompson, get that communication out to the communities regarding this, the EFF, just to let them know how this will be rolled out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we've already been reaching out. We've been already communicating and working with our communities on this. So moving forward, we will continue that practice. I have to say the department's been very good at both consultation and talking with staff and communities on the fire season, and we're moving forward on that. So we will continue to do that. In regards to the map, like Mr. Cavell said, we will bring forth the map the areas that we know that we're working on. And I apologize, did I just get cut out?
No, go ahead. You're still broadcasting. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that, Mr. Chair. The screen was getting fuzzy here. So yeah, so we will make sure we get those area maps to you. Again, it's traditional knowledge, and again, as Mr. Cavell said, it's not official, but we will get to those maps to committee, which is SCEDI, correct? Or do you want it to AOC?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Thompson. I think that would be more of a SCEDI item. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And yeah, thank you. With that, well, looks like we are done our Q&A. I want to thank Minister Thompson and staff, Mr. Gravel, and the rest of the crew for your presentation and your time. And you can sign off now. And I want to thank all the viewers that are listening in and listening with us. And we will take a short 5-minute recess, and where we'll be moving in camera. Yeah. So, but before we do that, can I get a motion to move in camera from one of the members? Get a verbal? Ms. Cleveland. Ms. Cleveland has moved that the committee move in camera. The motion is order. I don't see any opposition. We'll now go in camera, and now we will take a 5-minute break. Thank you.